The city had a way of pretending it was asleep when it was really just watching. And Harlem that winter evening carried the hush of a neighborhood waiting for something it could not yet name. Street lamps painted gold circles on wet pavement. And inside a modest brownstone, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat with the calm presence of a man who understood storms without needing to chase thunder. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and a small radio murmured news of a country struggling with its own contradictions. A nation that celebrated progress while quietly allowing certain people to be treated as invisible. Bumpy listened. Without reacting, his posture straight, his gaze steady, his silence speaking more loudly than the restless chatter outside. People in Harlem knew him not as a legend or a myth, but as a man who carried dignity like a shield, someone who believed. That strength meant standing firm when others tried to bend you with humiliation. Earlier that day, a young shop owner had arrived at his door shaken and angry, describing how a group of outsiders had walked through the neighborhood, speaking down to locals, treating the community like a place to conquer rather than a place filled with lives and stories. The shop owner's voice trembled as he spoke of insults disguised as jokes, of money demanded with the expectation that fear would do the rest. Bumpy listened without interruption, nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than furious. He had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. Injustice rarely arrived with honesty, and cruelty often wore a polite smile before revealing its sharper edges. The young man expected promises of retaliation, but instead Bumpy asked gentle questions, urging him to hold on to his dignity rather than surrender it to anger. That calm response traveled through the neighborhood faster than any rumor, leaving people both reassured and puzzled by his refusal to escalate the situation. Across town, Dutch Schultz carried himself like a man who believed the world was an arena built for his amusement, his name whispered in rooms where power and pride tangled together. In public memory, he often appeared larger than life, but beneath the polished suits and confident grin was a restless hunger for recognition, a need to prove that he could command attention even in places that refused to bow. His recent moves toward Harlem were less about profit and more about dominance, an attempt to test boundaries and remind everyone watching that influence could be forced into spaces where it did not belong. Those who observed him closely noticed the impatience in his gestures, the way he dismissed people who challenged him with quiet conviction. He did not understand Harlem's heartbeat, nor did he respect the resilience that had grown from years of being underestimated. The tension between these two men was not born from personal hatred, but from a clash of values that stretched far beyond individual ambition. Harlem had endured enough exploitation to recognize when someone arrived with an agenda that ignored its humanity, and Bumpy carried the unspoken responsibility of protecting that fragile sense of pride. When word spread that Dutch had begun sending men to observe the streets, measuring reactions and probing for weakness, elders gathered in small groups to discuss what might come next. Some feared confrontation, others demanded a show of strength. But most trusted that Bumpy would find a way to preserve peace without surrendering respect. He walked through the neighborhood that evening, greeting people by name, his voice soft but steady, reminding them that fear only grew when fed by chaos. Inside a quiet cafe near Lenox Avenue, a group of older residents watched him enter, their conversations fading as he took a seat by the window. One woman reached for his hand, her eyes filled with concern, asking whether the rumors were true about outsiders planning to make a spectacle of Harlem. He answered carefully, choosing honesty without alarm, explaining that respect could not be forced through noise or threats. His words settled over the room like a steady breeze, calming the unease that had begun to ripple through daily life. Bumpy believed that leadership meant more than protecting territory. It meant reminding people of their own worth when others tried to define it for them. As night deepened, whispers of a planned gathering at a downtown club reached him, a place where Dutch often entertained associates and displayed his influence like a performance. The invitation had not come directly. yet the message behind it was clear: an opportunity to test whether Harlem's quiet authority could stand in a room designed to belittle it. Bumpy considered the risk, understanding that stepping into such a space could invite humiliation, but he also recognized that refusing to appear might be interpreted as weakness. He dressed with care, choosing a suit that reflected dignity rather than extravagance, and walked through the streets accompanied only by the sound of his measured footsteps. The club pulsed with music and laughter that felt just a little too loud, as though the crowd sensed the tension beneath the surface. Conversations paused when Bumpy entered, eyes tracking his movements with curiosity and skepticism. Dutch sat at a table near the center, surrounded by men eager to echo his confidence, his smile widening when he noticed the calm figure approaching. The moment carried an undercurrent of challenge, not through raised voices but through the unspoken question of how two very different kinds of authority would share the same air. Bumpy greeted him politely, his tone respectful yet firm, refusing to play the role of a man seeking approval. What followed was not a shouting match but a conversation layered with subtle jabs and measured responses, Dutch attempting to provoke a reaction while Bumpy answered with composure that unsettled the room more than anger ever could. When a joke crossed the line into insult, aimed not only at him but at the dignity of Harlem itself, the laughter around the table faltered. Bumpy did not raise his voice. He simply let the silence stretch until even those who had been smiling began to shift uncomfortably. "Respect is a language everyone understands," he said quietly, the words carrying weight far beyond their volume. For a brief moment, Dutch's confidence flickered, replaced by a recognition that this was not a man who could be diminished through mockery. The evening ended without resolution, but the tension lingered like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Outside the club, a cold wind moved through the streets, carrying whispers of what might come next. Bumpy returned to Harlem with the same steady pace, aware that the confrontation had shifted something beneath the surface. Some interpreted his restraint as a sign of hidden strength. Others worried that Dutch would respond with greater aggression. Bumpy himself felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier than before, knowing that every decision he made would ripple through lives that trusted him to stand for something larger than pride. In the days that followed, small acts of intimidation began to appear: strangers lingering near local businesses, subtle attempts to unsettle residents without crossing into open conflict. Each incident was a reminder that injustice often crept forward in quiet steps before revealing its full shape. Bumpy met with community leaders, encouraging patience and unity rather than retaliation, reminding them that dignity was not measured by how loudly one fought, but by how steadfastly one refused to be reduced by cruelty. His presence became a source of reassurance, a living example of how strength could exist without aggression. One afternoon, a young boy approached him near a bookstore, asking why people were afraid. The question carried a simplicity that cut through the complexity of adult concerns, and Bumpy knelt to meet the child's eyes. He spoke gently about courage, explaining that real bravery meant protecting others without losing kindness. The boy listened intently, absorbing the quiet lesson in a way that words alone could not fully capture. Moments like that reminded Bumpy why he chose restraint over rage. Every action he took shaped the way the next generation would understand justice. Meanwhile, Dutch watched from a distance, frustrated by the absence of chaos he had expected to provoke. His associates whispered suggestions of stronger tactics, yet he hesitated, sensing that forcing confrontation might backfire against a man who thrived in calm defiance. The tension between them grew more psychological than physical, a battle of presence rather than force. Rumors spread that Dutch was planning a move designed to break Harlem's resolve, something dramatic enough to draw attention beyond the neighborhood itself. As winter edged toward spring, the air felt heavy with anticipation, each day stretching longer as if waiting for a decisive moment. Bumpy continued to walk the streets, greeting elders and children alike, his steady demeanor anchoring a community. Determined to hold on to its dignity, he spent evenings reading poetry and reflecting on the lessons learned from those who had endured far worse, drawing strength from the belief that justice was not a destination, but a practice repeated through countless small choices. The city around him buzzed with ambition and uncertainty, yet within Harlem there grew a quiet resilience shaped by shared hope. The first sign of escalation arrived with a letter delivered without a return address, its message brief but loaded with implication, a warning that Harlem would soon be reminded who truly controlled the city's narrative. Bumpy read it carefully, folding the paper with deliberate precision before placing it in a drawer. He did not share its contents widely, choosing instead to prepare quietly, reinforcing connections with those who valued respect over fear. His response was not a declaration, but a series of small, deliberate actions, visiting local leaders, strengthening alliances built on mutual understanding rather than dominance. On the night the rain began to fall heavier than usual, the streets reflected the glow of neon signs, and a sense of change moved through the neighborhood like a low hum. People gathered in doorways, watching the weather and listening for news, their conversations filled with equal parts worry and determination. Bumpy stood by his window, the city stretching out before him, aware that the path ahead would test not only his resolve but the spirit of everyone who believed in the quiet power of dignity. He breathed deeply, steadying himself, understanding that whatever came next would demand patience, wisdom, and the courage to remain composed when others tried to provoke chaos. The story of Harlem had always been one of endurance, of finding light in places where darkness seemed determined to linger, and Bumpy Johnson carried that legacy within every step he took. He knew that injustice thrived when people lost faith in their own worth, and his greatest challenge was not confronting an individual rival, but protecting the community's belief in itself. As the rain tapped softly against the glass and distant music drifted through the night air, he prepared for the moment when words alone might need to reshape a situation teetering on the edge of conflict, holding on to the quiet conviction that respect, once truly understood, could change the course of even the most stubborn storm. The rain had not stopped since the night Bumpy Johnson walked out of the downtown club with his dignity intact, and Harlem carried the echo of that moment like a secret whispered from doorway to doorway. People remembered the way the laughter had died when he chose silence over anger, yet the calm he projected now felt heavier, as though he sensed something forming beneath the surface that others could not yet see. Rumors drifted through barbershops and cafes that Dutch Schultz had taken the encounter personally, not because of any loud defiance, but because Bumpy's quiet authority had unsettled the room more than a confrontation ever could. For men who measured power by noise, being met with unwavering composure felt like an insult they could not quite explain, and the tension growing between the two worlds was no longer about pride alone. It was about whose vision of respect would shape the city's future. Harlem itself seemed to move more cautiously, the music from open windows softer, conversations lowering whenever unfamiliar footsteps passed by. Elder residents gathered on stoops watching strangers drift through the neighborhood with polished shoes and impatient eyes, their presence carrying a subtle message that Harlem was being studied, evaluated, tested. Shop owners felt the pressure most acutely. Deliveries arrived late, suppliers hesitated to extend credit, and small acts of inconvenience stacked together until they felt like deliberate attempts to weaken morale. Bumpy walked these streets every morning, greeting people with warmth that steadied their nerves, reminding them through quiet gestures that dignity did not require spectacle. Children followed him with curious eyes, sensing that something important was unfolding, even if they could not name it, and elders nodded with silent gratitude each time he paused to listen rather than speak. Across town, Dutch Schultz grew restless, surrounded by men eager to flatter him but unable to replicate the respect Bumpy inspired without raising his voice. The memory of that still moment at the club lingered in his mind, not as defeat, but as an unanswered question. He had expected outrage, perhaps even recklessness, yet Bumpy had responded with calm restraint that made every insult seem childish in comparison. Advisors urged him to escalate, to remind Harlem that influence could be enforced. But Dutch hesitated just long enough for frustration to twist into something more dangerous, a desire to prove that quiet strength could be shaken if pressed hard. Enough. The plan that began forming was less about confrontation and more about humiliation, a staged message designed to challenge the dignity that Bumpy carried so naturally. The first sign of that plan arrived in the form of a public gathering. Organized under the guise of charity, an event meant to draw attention from newspapers and city officials alike. Invitations were sent widely, including one addressed directly to Bumpy Johnson, written with a tone so polite it felt almost mocking. Friends urged him to decline, warning that the setting would be carefully controlled, the audience chosen to amplify any perceived weakness. Bumpy studied the invitation for a long time, his expression thoughtful rather than offended, understanding that refusing might allow others to define the narrative in his absence. When he finally accepted, he did so quietly, preparing not for a confrontation, but for a moment where composure would need to speak louder than any accusation. The night of the event unfolded beneath bright lights that felt colder than the rain. Outside, the ballroom filled with laughter that carried an edge of anticipation. Conversations slowed when Bumpy entered, his presence steady and dignified, his gaze calm as he greeted strangers with respect, regardless of how they looked at him. Dutch Schultz watched from across the room, a confident smile masking the tension. In his posture, surrounded by men eager to witness what they believed would be a spectacle. The speeches began with grand promises about unity and progress, yet subtle remarks slipped into the air, thinly veiled comments about who belonged where and who should know their place. Each word tested the patience of those who recognized the injustice beneath the polished language, and all eyes turned toward Bumpy, waiting for him to react. Instead of responding immediately, he listened, allowing the weight of the room's expectations to settle before he moved. When a speaker attempted to frame Harlem as a place in need of guidance rather than respect, murmurs rippled through the audience, and Dutch leaned forward as though expecting an explosion. Bumpy rose slowly, not with anger, but with the quiet grace of a man who understood that timing could change everything. He did not accuse or condemn. He simply thanked the organizers for inviting him and spoke about dignity as something shared rather than granted. His voice carried no bitterness, only a steady reminder that respect grew strongest when offered freely, not demanded through condescension. The room grew still, the tension shifting from anticipation of conflict to a deeper reflection few had expected to experience. Yet the real test came later, when whispers spread that a group of outsiders had been sent toward Harlem during the event itself. Their presence meant to unsettle the neighborhood while attention was focused elsewhere. News reached Bumpy quietly through a trusted friend, and for a brief moment, his eyes closed as if weighing the significance of what he had just heard. He excused himself without drama, leaving behind a room filled with confused glances, and stepped into the rain where the city felt suddenly heavier. The drive back to Harlem was silent, each passing streetlight reflecting off wet pavement like a question waiting for an answer. By the time he arrived, a crowd had gathered near a local storefront, tension humming in the air like a low drumbeat. 12 men stood nearby, their postures stiff, their expressions uncertain, as though they had expected chaos but found only watchful silence. Residents lined the sidewalks, refusing to retreat, yet determined not to escalate, their eyes turning toward Bumpy the moment he appeared. He walked forward without hurry, acknowledging the strangers with a respectful nod that caught them off guard. There were no threats, no raised voices, only the quiet authority of a man who understood that dignity could disarm hostility more effectively than force. One of the outsiders stepped forward, attempting to provoke a reaction with dismissive remarks about Harlem's resilience, but Bumpy did not rise to the bait. Instead, he spoke calmly about responsibility, reminding everyone present that actions taken in anger often left scars that lasted longer than any victory. His words carried through the crowd with unexpected warmth, shifting the atmosphere from confrontation to reflection. Some of the men sent to intimidate the neighborhood began to look uneasy, their confidence faltering as they realized they were being addressed not as enemies, but as individuals capable of choosing differently. Turning Point arrived in a moment so quiet it felt almost invisible at first. Bumpy reached into his coat and pulled out the folded invitation from the charity event, holding it up as a symbol of how easily appearances could be manipulated. He spoke about the difference between power and respect, explaining that true strength did not come from humiliating others, but from standing firm without losing compassion. The youngest among the outsiders lowered his gaze, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted, and one by one, the group stepped back, uncertainty replacing the bravado they had carried into Harlem. No command was given, no demand made. The shift happened simply because someone chose to speak with dignity when cruelty expected defiance. As the men left quietly, the crowd remained still, absorbing what had just unfolded. Some elders wiped tears from their eyes, not out of fear, but from the relief of seeing their community's worth affirmed without violence. Bumpy stood among them without seeking praise, his expression thoughtful as he looked toward the rain-soaked street where tension had dissolved into silence. Moment carried a deeper meaning than any victory could have offered, a reminder that injustice lost its power when met with unwavering respect. Later that night, as Harlem settled into a fragile calm, news of what had happened began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Even those who had doubted the strength of quiet authority found themselves reconsidering what true leadership looked like. Dutch Schultz received the message through one of the men who returned from Harlem, not as a threat, but as a reflection, that dignity could not be forced into submission, and that sometimes the loudest statement was made through silence. For the first time, he felt the weight of a challenge that could not be answered with bravado alone. Bumpy returned to his brownstone long after midnight, the rain finally easing into a gentle mist. He sat by the window, watching the city breathe, aware that the struggle for respect was far from over, but comforted by the knowledge that Harlem had chosen unity over fear. The events of the night lingered in his mind, not as triumph, but as proof that patience could transform even the most charged moments into opportunities for understanding. Outside, a faint light began to rise along the horizon, signaling a new day shaped by quiet courage and the enduring belief that dignity, once defended with grace, could inspire change far beyond a single street. The morning after the rain-soaked standoff arrived with a strange quiet that felt heavier than noise, as if Harlem itself were holding its breath, waiting to see whether peace would hold or fracture beneath unseen pressure. Newspapers spoke vaguely of a misunderstanding resolved, yet those who lived on the streets where everything had unfolded knew the truth ran deeper than headlines. Shopkeepers opened their doors cautiously, glancing up and down the avenue for unfamiliar faces, while elders gathered near cafe windows discussing what it meant that 12 men had walked into Harlem carrying tension and left carrying silence. Bumpy Johnson moved through the neighborhood with the same calm presence that had steadied hearts the night before, but there was a new gravity in his gaze, an awareness that what had just happened was not an ending but a turning point in a longer struggle for respect. News of the encounter reached Dutch Schultz in fragments, each retelling shaped by the disbelief of those who witnessed it. The man who returned to deliver the message did not speak like someone who had failed. Instead, he described the moment with quiet admiration, explaining how Bumpy had spoken with dignity rather than defiance, how the crowd had chosen unity over fear. Dutch listened without interruption, his fingers tapping against the edge of a glass, the faintest crease forming between his brows. He was not accustomed to opponents who disarmed conflict without raising their voices, and the more he thought, about it, the more unsettled he became. For a man who thrived on control, the idea that respect could not be forced felt like an invisible challenge, one that threatened to redefine how others saw him. In Harlem, the atmosphere shifted from tension to cautious reflection. Children returned to playing in the streets, though their laughter carried a watchful edge, and musicians allowed melodies to drift through open windows once more. Yet beneath the surface, something else was growing, a sense that the neighborhood had crossed a threshold, proving to itself that dignity could stand firm even when confronted by intimidation. Bumpy spent his afternoons visiting small businesses, not to celebrate, but to listen, encouraging people to speak openly about their fears and hopes. He knew that the greatest danger now was complacency. Moments of peace could easily be mistaken for permanent change, and he believed the community needed to remain grounded in its shared values rather than drift into false security. One evening, a letter arrived at his door, sealed carefully and delivered without a word. Inside was a brief invitation from a mutual acquaintance respected by both sides, suggesting a private meeting away from crowded rooms and public attention. The note hinted that Dutch Schultz wished to understand the man who had turned confrontation into silence, not as an enemy, but as a puzzle he could not solve. Bumpy studied the message for a long time, considering the risks, aware that stepping into such a conversation required balance and patience. Those closest to him warned that the meeting might be a trap meant to undermine his influence, but he sensed something different beneath the words, an opportunity to shift the story away from rivalry and toward reflection. The meeting took place in a quiet restaurant tucked between bustling avenues, a place where the clatter of dishes softened the weight of difficult conversations. Dutch arrived first, his confidence measured rather than flamboyant, and when Bumpy entered, the room seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm. They greeted each other politely, neither man raising his voice, their presence drawing curious glances from patrons who sensed history unfolding in subtle gestures rather than dramatic confrontations. For a long moment, they spoke about the city itself, the way ambition and struggle shaped every street, the way people searched for respect in places that often denied it. Beneath the surface, both men understood that the conversation carried deeper meaning, a chance to redefine how power could exist without humiliation. Dutch admitted, almost reluctantly, that the night in Harlem had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He expected Bumpy to gloat or challenge him openly, but instead Bumpy responded with quiet honesty, explaining that leadership was not about proving someone wrong, but about reminding people of their own worth. The words did not accuse. They simply existed, steady and sincere, leaving little room for argument. For the first time, Dutch seemed less like a man performing confidence and more like someone wrestling with a truth he had not anticipated. The conversation stretched longer than either expected, moving from tension to something closer to mutual understanding, though neither would have called it friendship. Outside, however, the city was less patient than the two men inside the restaurant. Rumors spread quickly that they were meeting, and not everyone welcomed the possibility of peace. Some individuals who benefited from division began stirring whispers that Harlem was being manipulated, that Bumpy's calm approach might be mistaken for weakness. Flyers appeared overnight with messages designed to provoke anger, attempting to fracture the unity that had grown after the rain-soaked encounter. When Bumpy learned of this, he felt a quiet sadness rather than rage, recognizing that injustice often adapted when challenged, finding new ways to test resilience. The true escalation arrived a few days later during a public parade meant to celebrate cultural pride. Crowds filled the streets with music and color, a moment meant to remind Harlem of its strength and creativity. Yet hidden within the celebration were individuals intent on provoking conflict. A sudden argument broke out near the front of the procession, voices rising as accusations flew, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the fragile peace might shatter. People turned toward Bumpy instinctively, searching for direction, their faces reflecting both fear and trust. He stepped forward slowly, raising his hand not as a command but as a gesture of calm, his presence alone enough to draw attention away from the chaos. He did not scold or demand silence. Instead, he began speaking about the meaning of the celebration itself, reminding everyone that joy and dignity were forms of resistance against those who expected them to fall into anger. His words moved through the crowd like a steady current, and gradually the shouting faded into murmurs, the tension dissolving into a shared breath. The turning point came when he invited both sides of the argument to walk beside him at the front of the parade, transforming confrontation into unity through a simple act of inclusion. Cameras captured the moment, not as a victory for one person, but as a testament to a community choosing respect over division. The aftermath of that day carried a quiet power that extended beyond Harlem. Newspapers that once overlooked the neighborhood began writing about the strength found in restraint, and people from other parts of the city visited simply to witness the calm resilience they had heard about. Dutch watched these developments from a distance, his perspective shifting as he realized that influence built on dignity resonated more deeply than displays of dominance. Though he remained a complex figure shaped by his own ambitions, the conversations with Bumpy left an impression that lingered beneath his confident exterior. As weeks passed, Harlem settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Musicians filled the evenings with melodies that carried stories of endurance. Poets gathered in small rooms to share verses about hope, and children chased each other beneath streetlights that seemed warmer than before. Bumpy continued to move quietly among the people, never seeking attention, yet always present when someone needed reassurance. He understood that the true victory was not a single moment of peace but the ongoing choice to uphold dignity in everyday interactions. One late night, as he walked home beneath a sky brushed with distant stars, he paused at the corner where the 12 men had once stood, remembering the tension that had filled the air. The street now felt calm, almost ordinary, yet the memory reminded him how fragile respect could be if left unguarded. He whispered a few lines of poetry under his breath, a habit he carried from younger days, and allowed himself a rare smile. The city was still imperfect, still capable of injustice, but it had witnessed something powerful. A community refusing to be defined by fear. The final chapter of that long season began with a silence that felt almost sacred, as though Harlem itself had stepped into a moment of reflection after weeks of tension and transformation. The streets moved at their usual pace, vendors setting up stands, children racing toward school, musicians tuning instruments near open windows, but beneath the ordinary rhythm lingered a quiet awareness that something unfinished still hovered in the air. Bumpy Johnson sensed it the way a seasoned sailor reads a change in the wind. The conflict that once threatened to erupt into chaos had softened into uneasy calm, yet unresolved questions remained, waiting for a moment strong enough to answer them without breaking the fragile peace that had been built. For days, Dutch Schultz had kept his distance, his presence reduced to whispers rather than headlines, and that absence unsettled many more than his earlier aggression ever had. Some wondered whether he was planning something larger, something meant to reclaim the narrative he had lost when Harlem chose dignity over fear. Others believed the quiet meant he was reconsidering his path, weighing the meaning of the conversations he and Bumpy had shared away from public eyes. Bumpy himself refused to speculate openly, choosing instead to focus on the community, reminding people that true strength came from unity rather than anticipation of conflict. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, when the city felt most honest, he allowed himself to acknowledge that the story between them was not yet complete. The turning point began with a rumor that spread like a low tide through Harlem's avenues. A powerful group of investors planned to reshape parts of the neighborhood, not through violence but through subtle displacement disguised as progress. Buildings would be renovated, rents quietly raised, and long-standing families pushed toward the edges of a city that already asked too much of them. The proposal arrived wrapped in polished language about improvement, yet those who read between the lines saw the familiar pattern of injustice: communities treated as stepping stones rather than homes. Bumpy felt a deep ache when he heard the details, recognizing that this challenge required more than quiet conversations. It demanded a public stand rooted in dignity and compassion. A gathering was organized at a historic theater, its stage, once filled with music and poetry, now prepared for a meeting that could define Harlem's future. People arrived dressed in their best clothes, not as a display of wealth, but as a declaration of self-respect, filling the seats with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Journalists lined the walls, sensing that the evening might carry consequences beyond a single neighborhood. When Bumpy stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, not because he commanded attention, but because his presence naturally invited reflection. He spoke not about resistance alone, but about belonging, reminding everyone that progress without humanity left emptiness where community once thrived. Halfway through the meeting, the unexpected happened. Dutch Schultz walked through the theater doors, unannounced and unescorted, his arrival sending a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. For a moment, tension returned like an old shadow, memories of past confrontations rising to the surface. Bumpy did not react with surprise or anger. He simply paused, allowing the room to absorb the weight of the moment before continuing. Dutch took a seat quietly near the back, his posture less imposing than before, as though he had come not to challenge, but to witness. The air grew thick with unspoken questions, and every word spoken on stage felt magnified by his presence. As speakers shared stories of families who had built their lives in Harlem despite decades of hardship, Dutch's expression softened in ways few had seen. The narratives were not accusations, but reflections of resilience, revealing a depth of humanity that statistics and rumors could never capture. Bumpy invited a local teacher to speak about her students' dreams, a musician to describe how art gave voice to struggle, and an elderly shopkeeper to recall the early days when neighbors supported each other through uncertainty. Each testimony layered emotional weight onto the room, transforming what could have been a confrontation into a powerful reminder of why dignity mattered. The suspense reached its peak when the organizers invited questions from the audience. A young man stood, his voice trembling with frustration, and addressed Dutch directly, asking whether the powerful ever truly saw Harlem as more than an opportunity. The question hung in the air like a challenge no one expected to be answered. All eyes turned toward Dutch, waiting for defensiveness or dismissal, but instead he rose slowly, his gaze thoughtful rather than confrontational. He admitted that he had once believed influence meant control, that he had measured respect by how loudly others reacted to him. Yet recent events had forced him to reconsider what true strength looked like. Bumpy listened carefully, his expression calm, giving Dutch the space to speak without interruption. When Dutch finished, the room remained silent, unsure how to respond to such unexpected honesty. That silence became the turning point of the entire story, not a dramatic speech or a grand gesture, but a shared pause where pride gave way to reflection. Bumpy stepped forward and offered a simple acknowledgement, saying that respect was not something one person could grant another. It was something built together through understanding. The words carried no triumph, only sincerity, and in that moment, the tension that had defined their relationship began to dissolve into something more complex and human. Outside the theater, the city seemed to hold its breath as the meeting ended. People lingered on the steps, discussing what they had witnessed, some wiping tears from their eyes as though a long-standing weight had finally lifted. Dutch approached Bumpy quietly, extending a hand not as a symbol of victory, but as a gesture of mutual recognition. They spoke briefly, their conversation unheard by the crowd yet visible through the respect reflected in their posture. Whatever differences remained between them, the moment marked a shift away from rivalry toward a deeper understanding of how influence could be used to protect rather than diminish. In the weeks that followed, the proposed changes to Harlem were reconsidered, not through force but through dialogue shaped by the unity displayed at the theater. Community leaders gained a stronger voice in decisions that affected their lives, and the narrative surrounding Harlem began to change in subtle yet meaningful ways. Musicians filled the nights with songs that carried hope. Children painted murals celebrating resilience, and elders spoke proudly of a time when dignity had turned tension into transformation. Bumpy continued his quiet work, refusing to take credit, reminding anyone who asked that real change belonged to the people who chose kindness over fear. The final scene of this long journey unfolded on a warm evening as the sun dipped low over the city skyline. Bumpy walked along Lenox Avenue, the hum of conversation and laughter wrapping around him like a familiar melody. He paused near a group of children playing with chalk on the pavement, watching as they drew bright shapes that transformed gray concrete into something vibrant and alive. One child looked up and asked whether the city would always be this peaceful. Bumpy smiled gently, explaining that peace was not something the world gave freely. It was something people created through everyday acts of respect. As night settled over Harlem, the lights of the neighborhood glowed with a quiet pride that needed no announcement. The long arc of conflict had not ended in triumph or defeat, but in understanding, a comeback reminder that even in a world shaped by injustice, dignity could rewrite the story when carried with patience and courage. Bumpy returned to his brownstone, sitting by the window where rain once tapped like a warning, now replaced by the soft murmur of a city learning to breathe again. The journey had changed everyone who witnessed it, leaving behind a legacy not of dominance but of humanity. And as the final notes of music drifted through the night air, it felt as though Harlem itself had stepped into a new chapter defined by respect, resilience, and the quiet power of a man who believed that true strength never needed to shout.